What's up, everybody? Peter X is a Coffee here, and welcome to another episode of Level Up the Personal Branding Podcast. So, doing season 3, and I'm going to do some episodes. I'm going to look at how sports and athletes brand. I mean, branding's important. I believe that musicians were the first to start branding, but the other major area I think where branding's prevalent and close to musicians is athletics. So and a lot of people follow athletics, so it's easier to relate to. So I'm gonna, season 3 will focus on that, and you know being abbreviated season, it's probably not going to be 11 episodes like season 2 was, but hey, it is what it is, and we'll roll with it until it's done. So the title of this episode is Athletes and Branding, looking at individual athletes. So, probably Babe Ruth, the Bambino, was the first. And then, of course, he had his own Baby Ruth candy bar. But the first to really, really do it well was Muhammad Ali, in my opinion. And then, Muhammad Ali borrowed heavily from professional wrestling. So there's a story. Ali met Gorgeous George in Vegas in 1961. So, Gorgeous George was there for a wrestling match, and Ali was there for a boxing match. And this is after Ali won the gold medal, obviously, in the 1960 Olympics. And, Gorgeous George is flamboyant, did the trash talking and the showmanship that became famous for professional wrestling. And Ali's admitted that he met Gorgeous George. They talked, and he borrowed from Gorgeous George. So, and why not? I mean, it's effective. Interestingly enough, in the 70s, I mean, professional wrestling in the 60s wasn't, huge like it got in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. It's fallen back a little, but it's still pretty big. But interestingly enough, in the 80s with the rise, professional wrestlers were borrowing from Ali, and that's how good he really took the that the flamboyance of the wrestling world. Ali, he had good branders around. I mean, Ali had his float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. He had his catchphrases. Ali had a the first in the world of athletics to have an innate understanding of branding. I mean, he branded himself the greatest. But his four biggest fights were branded very well too. 1971, the first fight with Joe Frazier, the fight of the century. The second fight, 1974, the super fight. 1974, his big boxing match with George Foreman, the Rumble in the Jungle, and then the final of the trilogy with Joe Frazier, the Thrill in Manila in 1975. So Ali was a master at branding. He, even his big fights, he was good at branding. Saw somewhere online. I mean, it was Reddit, so I tried to go further, but there was a claim that Bob Dylan and James Brown also were influenced by Gorgeous George. I don't know, but James did have the cape and all that stuff, and his sideman, Bobby Bird, and Morris Day would borrow that years later with the Mirror and Jerome Benton. But yeah, I don't know, but wrestling, there's a certain flair and showmanship and flamboyance that wrestling started that has filtered into the sports world over the years. Now, in my opinion, the best in branding when it comes to the sports world by far is the NBA. And it's because of their nicknames, you know. And nicknames in the NBA, you don't give it to yourself, it's given you by peers. And oftentimes it is, there's a truth to it. So they're earned and they say something about the qualities of whoever has it. So, I mean, there's a lot of them over the years. You know, but they're flamboyant, but they're also there's again, it says something about the way they played. So LeBron James, the King James, Hakeem Olajuwon, the Dream. I mean, Hakeem and the Dream, it rhymes, but hey, I mean, in my watching days, the best center I've ever seen was Hakeem Olajuwon, and would not want to guard the guy. So is it a dream or is it the nightmare, or is it an illusion of when you're winning that game and Hakeem comes back and destroys you. When I say that, I mean he's a contemporary of Shaq as well. Shaq, and during that time is called the most dominant player in the game, but he wasn't as dominant. It was more offensive where he dominated. When he was younger, he was a good defensive player, but Hakeem, dominated both ends of the floor. So, Irvin Magic Johnson, why Magic? Oh, look at his passes, Doctor Julius Irving, Doctor J. I mean, the guy could just sky and jump and you know. But doctors are experts. They heal you, and it's just like it's one of those cream of the crop of professions. And Julius Erving was a cream of the crop player. Back in the 70s. Going back to Akeem as well. Now, I said who I watched, the best center who I watched. Too young to remember Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in his prime. And remember, I mean, when he went to UCLA, college basketball banned dunking because of him. So when they changed the rules of the game, that says something. I mean, his Milwaukee Bucks years when he was a young guy, and I'll come back to this in this season 3, but you can watch the highlight videos, but in film, on YouTube, but it doesn't really do these, you can see glimpses of the greatness, but it just doesn't do justice to these players. I mean, watching a half hour, highlight film of Michael Jordan still doesn't, having watched Michael Jordan in his prime and all that, it still doesn't do Michael Jordan justice. It's one of the reasons why, the LeBron Michael Jordan, who's the GOAT, while that argument, at least, outside, with fans, goes. Because I think that's, the players are largely decided who the greatest is between those two. But anyway, George Gervin, the Iceman, yeah, he was cold, he was smooth. That nickname fits perfectly. Allen Iverson, the answer. I mean, Allen Iverson in his prime, I mean, great athlete. I think he was listed 6'1", 6'2", 180 pounds. I heard that he was like, 5'10", 140 pounds. And one of the quickest first steps of all time. Put him and Michael Jordan and what's his name he's with Cleveland right now. It'll come back to me, but he plays with Cleveland right now. Donovan Edwards, Donovan Mitchell. Donovan Edwards is college football from Michigan. So Donovan Mitchell. I mean, those three had that quick first step. Kobe Bryant was the Mamba. I mean, really stole the whole, from Michael and Michael Jordan, Michael Air Jordan. That's Michael. We'll get to him later. But the Black Mamba and just the the assassin nature on the court. Now I just wanted to rip your heart out. Jordan did it first, and for Kobe to steal Jordan's part of his brand and make it his own is something else. Tim Duncan, the big fundamental. Why? Because he did all the little things right, and most people now consider him the greatest power forward of all time, and it's reflected in his nickname, the Big Fundamental. Jerry West, Mr. Clutch, and the logo. So his silhouette is the logo for the NBA, but he hit a lot of big shots over the years. Michael Jordan, I mean, what can you say? Air Jordan, the guy could just fly. I mean, 48-inch vertical leap, 6'6". Considered by his peers as it's not close. Sorry, LeBron fans, but and LeBron's a great player, but it's about 70-30, across all generations, for Michael Jordan with the players. But I'll do we're gonna do a whole episode on the GOAT and the branding of all that and mistakes and whatnot. Shaquille O'Neal, the big diesel, Superman, the big Aristotle. Most of that stuff, Shaq gave himself, but, he was the most dominant player, in the paint, on the offensive end for years in the 90s. So, he got away with it. And of course, later Dwight Howard, took Superman, but as well. Karl Malone, the mailman, I mean, he delivered. I mean, he's probably widely considered the second best power forward behind Tim Duncan, and I think there's the gap there is not as wide when it comes to players as his other players. Gary Payton, the glove. Well, I was in the glove. I mean, his defense was legendary. So yeah, again, that's a great nickname, syncing up with what you do on the court and what you're known for. Dwayne Wade, the Flash, that was given to him by his speed, his quick first step. Not quite Donovan Mitchell, Allen Iverson, and Jordan, but he's probably there in that second, with Steph Curry and whatnot. Paul Pierce, the truth. I mean, big time guy. Big time moments, the truth, what's coming. Chauncey Billups, the Detroit Piston, Mr. Big Shot. He had a lot of, 7 straight trips to the Eastern Conference Finals, and he had a lot of big shots. Robert Horry, Big Shot Bob. I mean, how many game winners did he hit in the playoffs? I mean, he won it with 3 teams. I think he, got 7 rings, a great defensive player, and great 3-point shooter. And he earned the nickname Big Shot Bob or Rob. Kawhi Leonard, the Claw. Big hands, but I call him the ninja because he's kind of quiet and will sneak up on you. Chuck Pearson, old Indiana Pacer, the rifleman, because of his outside shot. Kevin Garnett was the big ticket. Yeah, because he was that guy. Artis Gilmore, the Chicago Bulls, and in the late in the 80s, he went down to San Antonio Spurs and played with George Gervin, Iceman, the A-Train. Why? Because, you can count on, the A-Train being there to take you home. Dan Marley, Thunder Dan. Dan, big muscular guy, had this great outside, three-pointer. Jamal Wilkes, there early in Magic Johnson's Laker run. Silk, yeah, the guy was just smooth. Vernon Maxwell, Mad Max, great defensive player, played with passion, great athlete. He was the dude. Stephon Marbury, Starbury, out of New York City, that classic New York City, Rucker Park kind of thing, or whatever borough he was from. I can't remember which borough Rucker Park's in, but I'm sure he played at Rucker. But and then his brand was trying to connect with the ordinary fans and do product lines, aimed at, working class folks. Clyde Drexler, the Glide, he could fly. David Robinson earned, the admiral, in the Navy, was an officer, and, the big game James, Los Angeles Lakers. Sean Kemp, Rain Man, he could get up in the clouds, snatch, particularly fast breaks and those alley-oops that he got from the glove. Yeah, my man. Well, who. Anyway, Bob Cousy, Houdini of the Hardwood. So that was one of the first. Nicknames. Giannis, the Greek Freak there in the Milwaukee Bucks. Robert Parrish, the Chief. He controlled the paint, for those great Boston Celtics teams in the 80s. Larry Bird, the hick from French Lick. So, Larry was never the guy you thought he was. The highlight films of Larry Bird will never do Larry Bird justice. That dude was cold. He was, average to above average athlete, but he knew the game, and he just, he was an assassin. He killed people. Sean Marion, the Matrix. Younger, he was just, he did amazing things. Rudy Gobert, the French rejection, so Rudy's known for his block shots and defense. So not the French connection, but the French rejection, because he is from France. David Thompson, the Skywalker, the dude had hops. Pete Maverick Pistol, his passing, he was the really Magic, got the nickname Magic, but he could have been called Magic too with what he did with the ball. Charles Barkley, the round mound of the rebound. That was his, what he was known for, his rebounds. He was always a big guy. He's still a big guy, but whatever. Vinnie Johnson, the microwave, 6-man off the bench, and when he got hot, and he was scary for the other team. So they, the microwave. Again, you see how many of these are rooted into how they played. Dominique Wilkins, the human highlight film. His dunks were works of art. Moses Malone, chairman of the board, so Moses, his leadership in really taking people, taking that 83 Philadelphia 76er team on his shoulders and taking them to the promised land and winning that championship. Will Chamberlain, the Big Dipper. He was the big dude back in the day. One of my favorites of this era, Kevin Durant, the Slim Reaper Durantula. So yes, he will, the Slim Reaper, because he'll kill you, Durantula. You don't want to get caught in that web. And then finally, Dale Griffith out of Louisville, played up in Utah. Guy could jump out of the gym. Dr. Duncanstein is what he was known for. But later in his career, he developed a three-point shot. And I remember reading one time, has Dr. Funkenstein become Dr. Strangelove? Because, Dr. Strangelove missiles and, nuclear warheads. So, yeah, Daryl Griffith. He was a, most of you young folks don't know who he is, but he was a baller. So let's go and look a little bit out of, outside of basketball. And, I think outside of basketball, I'm talking about some of the branding. So Chad Ochocinco, wide receiver, came in the league as Chad Johnson, changed his name to Chad Ochocinco, which is 85, and that's the number he wore. And that was part of branding there. Ochocinco's a little more interesting than Johnson. But he realized football was entertainment. And, he became an entertainer, particularly with his, touchdown celebrations. And some of them, were, he got fined and didn't care. And when he got criticized, he was like, hey, I'm here, we're entertainers, I'm entertaining. And he usually did it in a way that, did not demean the opponent. I think he did had a borderline, where he was on social media. I don't know if it must somehow social media at the end of his career. And, there's a big rivalry between the Cleveland Browns and the Cincinnati Bengals. So he was talking trash, with some of the secondary folks on Cleveland the week before. But, usually he kept it clean and it was all in fun and not putting down the opponent. Clinton Portis out of the Miami University, the U, played, started with the Denver Broncos, finished with the Washington Redskins, had a very good career. He sort of reached back into the professional wrestling realm, and he would have costumes and characters and would do comedy skits for the press corps. And, just go, Google, Clinton, or, no, go on YouTube and, put Clinton Portis in characters. I mean, he was good. He was good. He made the game fun. He was never, trashing opponents and what he did. And then baseball, Manny Ramirez, the Boston Red Sox. And there was the whole phrase, Manny being Manny. And usually, I mean, the press, I was, Googled it, it was used 1,621 times. And it usually referred to Manny Ramirez's obsession with baseball and, kind of forgetting everything else. He was kind of spacey a little bit for most of the time. So, I mean, some of the, examples of Manny being Manny, forgetting the paycheck in the boot. His high school coach said, if I said Manny, the game is tomorrow at 1 p.m., he'd be 2 hours early. But if I said Manny, there's a team pitcher tomorrow, he wouldn't show up, he'd forget. So, Manny was a little spacey, a little strange. He invited some ex-teammates and coaches to a Red Sox game and then forgot to give them the tickets and, get that process for them. And, they weren't too upset. They just said, well, that's Manny being Manny. Now, Manny being Manny, there was other, more negative things, a few negative instances where they used that, being disruptive or whatever. But for the most part, Manny being Manny was kind of, being strange and spacey, and he's, for the most part, a pretty good teammate. And usually it wasn't intentional. If he was a little disruptive, it was usually just him being strange. Yeah, so this episode is focused a lot on the NBA because they're good at it. But so we're going to go back and end with a couple of NBA players. The first is Charles Barkley. And Charles, back in the day, this is the early 90s, well, let's start. Charles has always been outspoken with politics, and when he first got in the league, he was very different than what he is now. So early on, he was a Republican. He was friends with Rush Limbaugh. He wanted to be the first Black Republican governor of Alabama, and now he's he's involved. He's evolved on even LGBTQ issues. He's evolved on race and stuff like that. And back in the day, he used to drive me crazy because he was he had that big platform. But over the years I realized that Charles Barkley is kind of like the dude in the black barber shop. And the black barber shop is where the non-college educated folks have those conversations. He's in a lot of ideas and community problems are discussed and hashed out in the barbershop. And that's kind of, I used to be like, Chuck, read a book. But then, athletes are busy folks, but he figured it out. And the other thing Chuck is known for too, Charles Barkley, is he had, I think it was a Nike commercial in the early 90s. I'm not a role model. And he said, I'm not. And essentially, he's like, I'm not a role model because this was, as we still do, putting up athletes as role models. But he said, and he said, your father should be your mother should be your grandfather. Someone close to you should be your role model. I should not be your role model. And so, um, I'll get into this, in the next episode when I look at leagues and sports and how they brand. But the NBA's always been a little looser and allowed folks to be themselves when it comes to branding. So Shaquille O'Neal's the next one. Shaquille's always been a goofball comedian. I mean, they're both, they're moving from TNT over to ESPN, Shaq and Shaquille, but you know, they have that flair and that chemistry, Shaquille and Charles Barkley. Hilariously, they got in a fight back in the day too. While in the NBA, so definitely YouTube that. But Shaq uses his comedy to lighten things up, and in a subtle form of leadership, by way of comedy. So Shaq definitely has a strong brand. He's invested very wisely. He's Papa John's, I think is his big thing now. But Shaq has been a pitch man for a lot of folks. And Charles, what's he pitching for right now? Talking about his stats. I can't remember, but Charles and Shaquille are always pitching something because they have a sense of humor and they're disarming. Finally, my man Kevin Durant. He's a different kind of guy. He's definitely anti-Jordan, anti-Kobe. Like, said early on when they tried to bring him into the GOAT debate in the NBA, he's like, I don't want any part of that. A lot of people view Kevin Durant as overly sensitive. He's been, found to, have feuds with fans on social media and is even, basically use disguises for names to feud with fans. And so, people find him prickly, thin skinned. The thing I like about Kevin Durant is he is who he is, but he enjoys the NBA and playing basketball for the sake of playing basketball and the camaraderie of his teammates. I mean, last year he was rumored to be going, Phoenix trade in the Suns, and they didn't. And he's like, look, I like these guys, and I think they sneaked in the playoffs and were gone in the first round. But he's a different dude. I mean, when he was during the pandemic, he was with the Brooklyn Nets, and Kyrie Irving could only play in road games because the state of New York had a law that you had to be vaccinated for COVID, and Kyrie Irving did not get vaccinated, and folks were furious, and they asked Kevin Durant, and he's like, well, that's just Kyrie being Kyrie. Now, if Kyrie Irving did that when Michael Jordan was a teammate, Jordan would have he would have forced personally forced and vaccinated Kyrie himself. That's how committed to winning that Michael Jordan was. So different, just a different dude. He moves differently, but I kind of like the fact he moves differently, and he's so fun to watch as a player. He's so smooth and whatnot. So yeah. So those are my athletes and branding. That's the first in season 3. I think the next episode we're gonna do is looking at how the different leagues and sports brand themselves, and how they've changed over years and how they've risen or fallen compared to their athletic competitors. So anyway, yeah, thank you for coming through. I got 6 albums of my own because usually I'm doing music, but again, branding's important, and we have to branch out a little and look at how other people brand. So I record under the name Exodus, XODUS. My first album is called Book 1, and I got the 317 Volume 1 and 2 out. I also have 2 science fiction fantasy novels and a novella that you can get on Amazon, and I write under the name Peter Exodus O'Coffer. So thank you again for coming through, and I will see you next episode.